The road to fascism is paved with socialism, and the road to communism is paved with nationalism. Now, if you have very fixed views on this topic, then I've already either wildly offended you or you just wildly disagree with me already. Well, let me explain myself first, because yes, on the surface, this is a total contradiction. It's fascism that is the ultra-nationalist one, and it's communism that is the ultra-socialist one. Well, the unity of opposites, nonlinear feedback loops, and, well, history tell a more complex story about these supposed distinct separate structures and ideas. So welcome. Thank you for being here. I'm Susan. So the unity of opposites, let's start there. Opposites, by nature of their polarity, form one single coherent whole, like two sides of a coin, or like in day and night forming the full 24 hours. Heraclitus was an Ionian, so from the ancient Greeks, and his idea was called the unity of opposites itself. And he talked about how the tension between opposites is actually what created harmony between them. The tension between opposites unites them into one, into the unity of opposites. Opposites are only intelligible because of each other. So again, the night and the day. The night weaves into the day, and the day weaves into the night. They give rise to each other, they feed each other, they collapse into each other, and they are only intelligible because of each other. Now, the Daoists, at the very heart of their philosophy, is the same idea, yin and yang. The yin and the yang feed each other. They collapse and they rise into each other. And they are only known because of each other. Everything we can describe, so everything that has attributes, is dual at its foundation, because definition itself requires contrast. Opposites are like holographic reflections, mirror images of each other, that without each other, the contours, the attributes cannot be known or defined. And these opposites, at the foundation of everything in their duality, come together to create one coherent whole in unity. So how can we better understand this idea using more modern language? Well, let's take a look at very high-level systems theory for a moment. So in complex systems, opposites don't form a neat little line. They form a circle. So opposites, when they go out, instead of continuously getting farther and farther apart, they actually come closer and closer together because they converge. So, for example, the extreme left and the extreme right, or communism and fascism. As they get further and further extreme, or more and more extreme, they don't get further apart. They get closer. They get closer and closer together until eventually they converge into each other and they collapse into each other. In my Wisdom as a Paradox episode, I talked about needing to think spherically as opposed to thinking linearly if you want to see the whole of something, if you want to be with the true complexity of something, to be with all the parts, so you can find the synthesis in which wisdom emerges out of. And that's what we want to do here. But let's take a look at an example of nonlinear feedback loops and the oscillation pattern they form with each other to put it into more context. So we take a look at an example in nature. So predator and prey. We'll use wolves and deer. So the wolves, of course, are the predators, and they eat their prey, the deer. And as they do, over time, the population of the deer, the prey, is going to decrease. But then over time, as the population of the deer, the prey, decreases, well, now the population of the wolves, the predators, are going to decrease because they have less food supply. But then as there's less wolves over time, the deer can now increase in population because they have less predators that are eating them, so they can now rebuild their population. But then as there's more deer, the wolves have a greater food supply, so now the population of wolves increase. And now you can hopefully see how this pattern continues, and there's this natural oscillating pattern, or this natural oscillating non-linear feedback loop. They feed each other. They rise because of each other, and they go in and out of each other. And they are only distinguishable because of each other, predator and prey. Fascism and communism, or extreme right and extreme left, are the same. Now, importantly, the unity of opposites here means that any polarity point actually reinforces that original point itself and vice versa. So choosing the exact opposition to something does not free you from that system. It keeps you in the same system and in the same frame. Real change, however, requires you to shift the frame or to choose a new axis. So let's take a look at a few historical examples briefly. So a couple fascists. We can take a look at Italy's Mussolini and Germany's Hitler. So Mussolini was the most explicit example of a fascist whose road was paved by socialism, because he was an outright socialist in the beginning. He was a socialist. His political party was socialism. His movement was very socialist-based, his rhetoric, his sentiment, the grievances, etc. It wasn't until the First World War in which Mussolini started pivoting, or rather I should say merging, with more ultra-nationalist rhetoric, sentiment, policies, etc. And he actually said something very interesting in his doctrine of fascism. So Mussolini wrote, quote, "But when brought within the orbit of the state, fascism recognizes the real needs which gave rise to socialism and trade unionism, giving them the weight in the guild or corporative system in which divergent interests are coordinated and harmonized in the unity of the state," unquote. Mussolini admits here that socialism and trade unionism, as he say, rise from real social needs, as does all socialism. It rises from very real grievances, very real challenges and failures. So things like workers' rights, protections, welfare. But instead of dissolving class divisions as socialism aims to with its original initial rhetoric, fascism is able to appropriate those same structures and absorb them into the state, because that's where communism will always lead you. The unity Mussolini talks about is not classless solidarity, but national solidarity. But what's the difference really between classless solidarity and national solidarity? But even as he says, they are just divergent interests under the banner of a nation. So fascism says you may have competing interests, but you all serve the nation first. And communism says you may have competing interests, but you all serve the nation first. Tomato, tomato. This is where the interplay of opposites becomes so clear. So socialism centralizes power through redistribution and welfare. Fascism then takes that centralization and blends it toward national unity and authoritarian corporatism. But does communism ever lead you anywhere else? Is this not the road? Is this not the pattern in which communism always follows? Because what is communism? It is, again, an ideology, not an economic structure. And it is an ideology that supports the equal redistribution of the means of production, of wealth, and of private property. But in order for that to happen, who is going to do the redistribution? Who is going to make sure that everyone gets exactly the same thing, nothing more and nothing less? This is why it requires centralized control. Enter fascism. They lead into each other. They bleed into each other. They feed each other. They collapse into each other. Now, Hitler was similar, but one separate point I want to point out about him was that he referred to himself, as well as his political party, as nationalist socialist. So he actually was already merging the two from the very beginning. And this is because he was so extreme that, in my view, Hitler was already on that convergence point. He was already where these things collide. So on the communist side, let's take a look at a few examples: Stalin, Mao, and Pol Pot. Although Stalin, Mao, and Pol Pot are remembered as communists, and they certainly were, their road was paved with nationalism, with ultra-nationalism. So Stalin, for example, he reframed communism as, quote-unquote, socialism in one country, and his big rally was, quote, Mother Russia. Mao in China was similar. He cast his movement as China's liberation from centuries of humiliation, tying socialism to restoring national pride and sovereignty. Mao was an outright Chinese nationalist. Pol Pot did the same in Cambodia, presenting his brutal and evil revolution as a reclamation of the purity of the Khmer identity. Communist revolutions around the world have often ignited because of a real struggle against foreign imperialists. And this makes sense. It's a struggle for dignity, sovereignty, survival. But that initial noble intent gets co-opted by choosing nationalism and socialism as the opposition to imperial domination. They end up recreating the same patterns they seek to escape at home, and that is what they have always done. So centralization, control, repression, and external authority. This is what they create at home instead of having it abroad. And this is because of the unity of opposites. Ultimately, both fascism and communism, the extreme right and the extreme left, ultra-nationalism and ultra-socialism create each other. They feed each other. They collapse into each other. And they converge at the same point, which is one of centralized power and control from a political, economic, and cultural perspective. They both create structures of centralized control in which one of the other can feed off of. They also both converge in centralizing identity. There's only one identity you can have, and there is only one person in power, and it's not you. Now, there is a theory from economist Manker Olson called the collective action theory that essentially says in smaller groups it's easier to self-organize for change, but in larger groups it's much harder. And that makes sense, right? So the larger the group, the bigger the population, the greater the collective, the harder it is to mobilize for change. But because of this dynamic, it means that larger groups are more likely to collapse into coercive leadership when there are enough grievances that are seeking change. And this is why, essentially, we always tip the scales. Because it's so hard for there to be a synthesis amongst a larger, more complex system, we just collapse. We collapse into coercive leadership, into centralized power, into centralized control, which is ultimately authoritarianism. Extremes take hold because collapsing into them is easier than holding the balance of complexity. Extremes feel simple and certain. But a real coherence requires seeing the whole system, holding paradox, and working within that tension. Nationalism and socialism both serve a purpose when balanced, but they escalate together when pushed to extremes. So the Nordic countries, for example, they prove socialist programs work because of, not in spite of, strong capitalist markets, freedoms, and the decentralization of an open market that prevents collapse into authoritarian cycles. Extremes are intellectually lazy. Balance is hard. Okay, that is my rant for today. Thank you so much for being here. I know this isn't a popular topic, nor is it a cool perspective to take. So if you watched the full episode, thank you so much for being here. Let me know what you thought. Let me know what you think. And take care. I will see you next time.